Firstly, I'd like to introduce Kerry McCarthy, who's the MP who travelled to Russia to watch part of the trial. So I'm not going to say too much, but I'd like to introduce Kerry McCarthy and come to the stage.
I'm not sure I can live up to Sarah's billing, so thanks for that. Be prepared to be underwhelmed. But as she said, I'm here because a few weeks ago now, I went out to Russia pretty much on the spur of the moment. I got an email from the Free Pussy Riot campaign team, just who'd been following me on Twitter, and they knew that I was the one politician, I guess, that had been taking an interest in the court case. And that was because I'd read about it on music websites. And it wasn't something that was being picked up at all by the mainstream press or by politicians. I'd tabled a couple of parliamentary questions. But as it happened, when I went out there, the public interest as the trial started suddenly exploded, which was fantastic. The fact that the eyes of the world were actually what was happening on what was happening in that small courtroom in Moscow. And although I met a couple of members of Pussy Riot when I arrived in Moscow. We went round to someone's flat and met a whole bunch of activists, and what was striking actually was they were young people that hadn't been that political until quite recently, but there really is a growing and strengthening opposition movement in Russia, which covers all the bases. You've got the oligarchs and the imprisoned business people, you've got people who come from quite a right-wing libertarian point of view, like Navalny, who's being threatened with being charged now, but then you've also got, on the other end of the spectrum, people like Pussy Riot, people who are involved in performance art and public protests and street protests and have come up out of the music scene, but not even so much the music scene, but the performance art scene. So you've got a whole spectrum of people that are coming together, and I met some of them. But I didn't actually get to meet Nadia, Katya and Marsha, but I was for 12 hours a day for 2 days sitting a few feet away from them in the courtroom as they sat in that glass box, and prison guards around them, armed guards, Rottweilers and Alsatians in the courtroom. I don't know quite what they thought they were needed for, but it is undoubtedly the case that the trial was very heavily biased towards the prosecution. You had prosecution lawyers, you had lawyers acting for the so-called victims, who were the people that observed the punk prayer in the cathedral. The defence weren't really allowed to question the prosecution witnesses, and if I give you one example, one of the expert witnesses called by the prosecution was someone who tried to get South Park banned in Moscow after the episode with Dr. Hanky the Christmas Poo, because they thought that was an outrage to public morals, and he was actually being cited as to give evidence as to why Pussy Riot were also a threat to Russian values. And that was a theme that ran throughout the trial. It was, you are a threat to our society, you are a threat to our values. It's just the way, it's not about what you actually did, it's what you are, what you represent, the fact that you're feminists, the fact that you're punks, the fact that you're women that dare speak up for themselves. That was why they were on trial, because they dared to speak out, they dared to be themselves, and they dared to criticise Putin. And what was phenomenal is that even though the odds were stacked against them, they knew that they were going to go to jail. They were potentially facing a 7-year jail sentence. They'd been banned from seeing their children. Nadia and Masha are both mothers. They weren't allowed to see their children while they were in jail. And Nadia was also banned from seeing her husband Peter because he'd led the protests against their imprisonment. But what was amazing is they refused to behave the way that women are expected to behave in that situation. They were expected to be cowed, to be scared, to be sitting there terrified of what fate awaited them. But instead they were absolutely defiant. And if you read their closing statements, I think those closing statements as statements of, as I said, defiance against Putin's regime, of determination to carry on fighting no matter what the consequences were for them and their families. I think they'll be studied by political students in many years to come, because they really do symbolise, they were so articulate, so intelligent. And when you look back, I think one of the reasons why people didn't take the Pussy Riot case seriously was because, they got a silly name, they look, silly balaclavas and outfits, they were doing the can-can in a church. People didn't realise quite how important what they were doing were, and they were actually taking on not just Putin, but the powers of the church, which is very strongly aligned with Putin. The church that they performed in wasn't, I've been to lots of churches in Russia, and some of them are very, very spiritual, holy places, there's incense and there's very devout people praying. This was actually if you like, the apex of where the business interests, the political interests and the church power base met. Underneath it is a very expensive restaurant, there's even a car wash, there's lots of shops, and there's something very sort of almost clinical and sterile about it. There's tourists there, but they weren't performing in the middle of a church service or anything like that. So they chose it not because they wanted to attack religion, which is what they were charged with. The offence they were convicted of was hooliganism motivated by religious hatred, which is a completely falsified claim. It wasn't about attacking people who have religious faith. It was about attacking the church's support for Putin. And this song was calling on the Virgin Mary, who they said was a feminist, to help them get rid of, to join forces with them and help drive Putin out. And I actually sat in court while the prosecution lawyers, or the lawyers for the so-called victims, said Virgin Mary cannot be a feminist because feminism is a mortal sin. And when they're up against that, they were sitting there in that glass cage in court because they were feminists, and feminism is a mortal sin, and that was one of the reasons why they were convicted. So I just want to finish by saying, it's brilliant that this is happening. There's been events all around the world. You've had people like Madonna and Paul McCartney and people as famous as you can get speaking out. But I think it's also really important that artists at all levels are speaking out, because probably this is the sort of place that Pussy Riot would be performing if they were allowed to go out and perform. And we can't give up the fight. As we know, there's going to be an appeal here in which the very best we can expect from that is they'll reduce the sentence a bit, but that still does mean that they'll be sent out to the penal colonies. They won't be able to see their families, hundreds of miles away from Moscow. The next step will be that the lawyers are able to take it to the European Court of Human Rights, because Russia is actually a signatory to the European Convention. So we've just absolutely got to keep up the pressure and carry on supporting not just the 3 members of Pussy Riot that are in jail, but the other people that are part of the Pussy Riot collective, and everybody in Russia that is fighting against a system that doesn't allow them to be themselves, doesn't allow them to protest, and wants to overturn this regime. Thank you.